Welcome to my channel, where creativity meets originality. I'm here to bring you content that stands out, keeps you engaged, and maybe even surprises you. If that sounds like your vibe, go ahead and subscribe. You won't regret it.
Never thought I'd be the kind of man who checks his wife's phone. I was raised to believe that trust was the foundation of everything. My father told me that the day he handed me the keys to his old Ford pickup when I turned 16, trust people until they give you a reason not to. For 22 years of marriage, I held on to that. Even when the signs were there. Even when my gut told me something was wrong. I held on. My name is Marcus. I'm 47 years old, and I run a mid-sized civil engineering firm in Austin, Texas. I built it from scratch, started as a junior surveyor at 24, saved every dollar I could, took out a second mortgage on a tiny house I could barely afford, and launched my own company at 31. For the first 5 years, I worked 16-hour days. My hands were always dirty. My back always hurt. My wife, Sandra, used to bring me coffee at 10 at night when I was hunched over blueprints at the kitchen table. She'd set the mug down without a word, rub my shoulders for a minute, then go to bed. That was love, I thought. Quiet, steady, no drama love. We got married at 25, both of us young and broke and absolutely certain we were invincible together. Our son Tyler came 2 years later. Then our daughter Lily, 4 years after that. By the time I turned 40, we had a good life. Not flashy, but real. A house in a neighborhood where the kids could ride bikes, a dog named Chester who ate everything he shouldn't, 2 cars in the driveway, and Friday night dinners that almost always ended in us laughing at something Tyler said. I didn't know when it changed. That's the honest answer. I tried to trace it back to a specific moment and I can't. Somewhere around the time Sandra went back to work, Lily was 12, old enough to be home alone after school. Something in her shifted. She got a position at a commercial real estate development company, junior account manager. Within a year, she was good at it. Within 2 years, she was excellent. I was proud. I told anyone who'd listen that my wife was one of the sharpest people in that office. What I didn't realize was that she'd already decided I was the ceiling and she was looking for a window. It started with small things. She'd come home later than expected and her explanation would be slightly off. The timeline didn't quite add up, but when I mentioned it, she'd make me feel like I was being paranoid. She started going to the gym on Saturday mornings, which was fine, except she'd never cared about the gym before. Her phone, which she used to leave on the kitchen counter without a second thought, was now always face down and always with her. She started laughing differently, lighter, more self-conscious, like she was practicing a version of herself that I wasn't the audience for. I ignored it. I told myself I was projecting. I was busy with a major highway expansion project, stressed, not sleeping well. Men like me convince ourselves that if we just keep working, the problem will resolve itself. That's what we do. We fix things with effort, not conversation. The night it all came apart started ordinary. I got home early for once. The project manager under me had handled the afternoon site inspection without a problem, and I'd told my assistant to hold my calls after 4. I wanted to take Chester for a long walk before dinner, maybe sit with Sandra on the back porch and actually talk for an hour. I genuinely wanted that. I missed her. She wasn't home. I didn't think much of it. I texted her and she said she was finishing up something at the office. I walked Chester, came back, started making pasta. She came in around 7:30, still in her work clothes, and something about the way she moved when she walked in. Quick, almost practiced. Made me feel like I was watching someone enter a room they'd rehearsed entering. Dinner was quiet. Tyler was at college. Lily was at her friend's place for the weekend. It was just the two of us, and the silence between us felt different from our usual comfortable quiet. It felt managed. After dinner, she said she was tired and going to take a bath. I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of bourbon and tried to figure out what I was feeling. It wasn't suspicion, exactly. It was more like grief. Like I was already mourning something I hadn't been told was gone yet. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She'd left it. She never left it. She never left it. I stared at it for a long time. Then I looked. I'm not proud of that, but I looked. The name in the messages was Derek Holloway, her colleague. I'd met him once at a company holiday party. Tall, mid-40s, easy smile. The kind of guy who seems to know exactly how charming he is. The messages went back 4 months. I read maybe a dozen before I had to put the phone down and just breathe. There was nothing ambiguous about them. This wasn't an emotional affair dancing around the line. It was fully across the line, with both feet planted. I put the phone back exactly as I found it. I went to the bedroom door, knocked, told her I was heading to bed early. My voice was steady. I don't know how. She said goodnight through the door like everything was normal, and I lay in the dark for 6 hours without sleeping, doing math in my head. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about our prenuptial agreement. We'd signed one before we got married. Sandra had actually suggested it. Her parents had gone through a brutal divorce when she was a teenager, and she'd seen what happened when there was no legal clarity. Our agreement was straightforward. In the event of infidelity, the cheating party forfeited the right to any claim on the business and primary residence, and custody of any minor children would default to the faithful spouse. At the time we'd signed it, we were laughing a little, because it felt so formal for two broke 25-year-olds with nothing to their names. The lawyer who drew it up was a friend of my father's. He'd told us the best prenup is the one you never need. I needed it now. The next morning, I went to the office at 6, called my attorney, and set up a meeting for that afternoon. I also called a private investigator, a man named Philip Stokes, whom I'd used once years ago for a business matter. I explained the situation. He was professional and unsentimental about it. He said he'd have documented confirmation within 2 weeks if there was anything to confirm. He had it in 9 days. I didn't say a word to Sandra. I kept coming home for dinner. I kept making coffee in the morning. I walked Chester. I slept on my side of the bed. For nearly 3 weeks, I maintained a version of our life that was already over, because my attorney told me to wait until the paperwork was fully prepared before I made any move. I've never felt more alone in my life than during those 3 weeks. Lily came home for a school break right in the middle of that period. She was 16, bright, perceptive. She noticed something was wrong with me within about 4 hours of being home. She didn't say anything directly. She's like me that way. She observes before she speaks. But I caught her watching me a few times at dinner with this careful, measured look on her face that made my chest hurt. The Sunday before I planned to have Sandra served, Lily found me in the garage. I was reorganizing tools I didn't need to reorganize, which is what I do when I'm thinking. Dad. She sat on the workbench and looked at me. What's happening? I wasn't ready to tell her, but she had her mother's eyes and her grandfather's stubbornness, and she was not going to let me off with nothing, sweetheart. I told her there were some problems between her mother and me, that we were going to be sorting through some things, and that she shouldn't worry about where she'd be living because she'd be with me. She went very still. Is it Derek Holloway? I set down the wrench I'd been holding. I saw a message on Mom's phone 2 months ago, she said quietly. I didn't mean to. She'd asked me to check if she had any missed calls. I only saw a second, but I knew it wasn't. It didn't look right. She paused. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to blow up the family if I was wrong. I crossed the garage and hugged my daughter for a long time without saying anything. She was shaking a little. I told her she hadn't done anything wrong. I told her that none of this was on her. Are you going to be okay, Dad? I told her yes. I wasn't sure I believed it yet, but I told her yes. Sandra was served at her office on a Tuesday morning. My attorney had arranged it with the kind of precision that, under different circumstances, I would have admired. The divorce petition, a copy of the prenuptial agreement with the relevant clause highlighted, and a formal notice that I was suspending joint access to our shared accounts pending the proceedings, all delivered by a process server at 10 in the morning when her office was full. She called me 17 times between 10 and noon. I let every call go to voicemail. She came home at noon. I was there. I'd asked Lily to stay at her friend's house for the night. I didn't want her in the middle of the confrontation I knew was coming. Sandra came through the door pale and furious in equal measure. She said she could explain. I told her I wasn't interested in an explanation. She said the prenup wouldn't hold up, that it was outdated, that her lawyer would challenge it. I told her she was welcome to try and that I was confident in our documentation. She said I was being cruel. I told her that cruelty would have been letting this go on longer than it already had. Then she said something that I still think about sometimes, not because it hurt. It had stopped hurting by then, but because of how clearly it showed me who she had become. She said, Derek says you are never really a partner to me. You were just a provider. He says I deserve more than a man who treats marriage like a business contract. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, the man who's currently going through his second divorce and lives in a corporate apartment on South Congress told you that. She didn't have an answer for that one. I told her I wanted her out of the house within a week. I told her Lily would be staying with me. I told her my attorney would be in touch. Then I went to my study and closed the door, and I didn't come out until I heard her car leave the driveway. Here's what happened to Derek Holloway over the next several months, and I want to be clear that very little of it was anything I engineered. The man had a gift for self-destruction that I could never have matched. First, Sandra had apparently not been his only extracurricular activity. His wife, a woman named Patricia, had been quietly building her own file for longer than I had. She filed for divorce the same week Sandra and I separated. I found out later that someone, and I have my suspicions it was Lily, had found a way to get information to Patricia. I never asked Lily directly. She's a lot smarter than I give her credit for. Derek's company, when they learned that his affair with Sandra had led to a process server showing up and a significant amount of internal gossip, placed him on administrative leave pending an HR review. Apparently, I wasn't the first spouse who'd made noise about conduct in that office. 3 weeks later, he was gone. Patricia, as it turned out, was the one with the financial standing in their marriage. The house, the lake property, the investment accounts, all in her name or in trusts her family had established. Derek walked away from his marriage with his personal belongings, a lease on a 1-bedroom and a reference letter he'd have a hard time using given the circumstances of his departure. The last I heard, he was doing freelance consulting work and had moved to a different city. I didn't feel satisfied exactly. I felt something closer to neutral, like watching a storm damage someone else's property. Unfortunate, but not your concern. My divorce was finalized 8 months after I filed. The prenup held completely. Sandra received her personal property, her car, a cash settlement of $70,000 more than the agreement required, and I'll explain why in a moment, and no claim on the business or the house. She moved into an apartment across town. Lily, by her own choice and by legal arrangement, lived with me. The $70,000 was my decision, not my attorney's. She pushed back on it. My reasoning was simple. I didn't want Sandra coming back in 5 years, when times were harder, and having any legitimate grievance that she'd been left with nothing. The settlement was generous enough that she had a real foundation to rebuild on. I wanted her gone, not destitute. Those are different things, and the difference matters to me. Lily struggled. I want to be honest about that because I think stories like mine sometimes skip over the part where the kids are not okay for a while. Lily was 16, and her mother had made choices that had fractured everything she thought was stable. She didn't stop talking to Sandra, but the relationship was different. Careful, a little formal. Like two people who'd been through something and hadn't fully processed it yet. She had a therapist she saw on Thursdays. She threw herself into her junior year with a focused intensity that I recognized as a coping mechanism because I'd used the same one. I kept working. I had the highway project and 2 new commercial contracts that kept me busy enough to not completely fall apart. My business partner, a guy named Fred, who'd been with me since year 3, covered for me more than he should have and never once made me feel bad about it. That kind of loyalty is rare. I told him so, eventually. About 6 months after the divorce was final, a mutual friend of mine and Sandra's, a woman named Helen, who'd been in our circle for over a decade, invited me to a charity gala her organization was hosting. I almost didn't go. I'm not a gala person. I own exactly one suit that fits well, and I wear it reluctantly. But Helen said it would be good for me to get out, and she had a way of saying things that made you feel like declining was not really an option. At the gala, I ended up seated next to a woman named Claire. She worked in landscape architecture. She was 43. She had 2 teenagers of her own from a previous marriage, and she had a dry, quiet sense of humor that caught me completely off guard. We talked through dinner and then after dinner, and then standing on the venue patio for an hour past when either of us had meant to stay. She was the first person I'd talked to in months who didn't know my history and didn't treat me like someone who needed to be handled carefully. I asked for her number. She gave it to me, then said, "Just so you know, I'm not interested in anything dramatic. I've had dramatic. I want boring." I told her I was possibly the least dramatic person she'd ever met. She laughed and said, "We'll see." Whiskey turned into coffee, which turned into dinner, which turned into slow and careful and honest. Claire didn't rush anything, and neither did I. We'd both been through enough to know that the absence of urgency was its own kind of luxury. Lily met Claire for the first time about 4 months in. I'd been nervous about it in a way I hadn't expected. I'm not generally an anxious person, but my daughter's opinion mattered to me more than I knew how to say. The 3 of us had lunch at a place Lily picked, which I thought was a good sign because she'd wanted some control over the situation. Lily and Claire talked about landscape architecture for most of the meal. Lily was considering environmental science as a major, and by the time the check came, they were exchanging opinions about native Texas plant species with a seriousness I found both amusing and deeply reassuring. On the drive home, Lily said, "She's real, Dad. not performative. I like that. I said I like that too. Tyler was harder to read. He'd been at UT when everything fell apart, and he'd come home for a weekend in the thick of it. Walked into a house where his mother was packing boxes and his father was operating on about 3 hours of sleep. He was 22, old enough to understand the situation, but young enough that it still hit him like a physical thing. He was polite to me and distant, which is Tyler's version of hurt. He needed time. We started calling each other on Sunday evenings, not about anything in particular. Sports, his coursework, a problem he was having with a group project. Something stupid Chester had done that week. We rebuilt it like you rebuild anything, one small piece at a time. By the time he met Claire, a year after Sandra and I divorced, he was ready. He shook her hand and said, "My dad talks about you," and I saw Claire's face do something subtle and complicated and good. He told me later he thought she seemed solid. Coming from Tyler, that was a full endorsement. Sandra and I had one real conversation, about 14 months after everything. She reached out and asked if we could meet for coffee. I said yes because Lily had asked me to at least hear what her mother had to say, and because I'd decided a long time ago that the opposite of hatred wasn't forgiveness necessarily. It was indifference. I didn't hate Sandra anymore. I had nothing left to protect myself from. We met at a coffee shop near downtown, neutral territory. She looked different, lighter somehow, or maybe more honestly herself. She'd cut her hair. She'd apparently stopped working in real estate and was doing something with a non-profit she'd gotten involved with. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She said, "I know I can't fix what I broke. I just wanted you to know that I know it was wrong." She looked at her coffee cup when she said it. I convinced myself for a long time that I was justified, that I was unhappy, and that made it okay. It didn't. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "I know." She asked about Lily. I told her Lily was doing well, that they'd have to build that bridge themselves, and I'd stay out of it. She nodded like she'd expected that and appreciated it anyway. When I stood up to leave, she said, "Are you happy?" I thought about Claire. I thought about Lily telling me Claire was real, not performative. I thought about Sunday evening calls with Tyler and Chester still eating things he shouldn't, and the way my firm had grown in the past year to the point where Fred and I were looking at opening a second location. I said yes. Honestly, without qualification. Yes, she nodded and looked back down at her coffee. I walked out into a queer October morning and drove to the office, and I didn't cry in the car, which I considered a genuine personal achievement. Claire and I got married the following spring. Small ceremony, backyard of a friend's property just outside Austin, string lights and a bluegrass band she'd found through someone Lily knew. Tyler gave a short speech that managed to be funny and sincere at the same time, which is a hard combination to pull off at 24. Lily stood next to me for the ceremony because she'd asked if she could, and I'd said she didn't even need to ask. At one point during the reception, I stepped away for a few minutes and stood at the edge of the property where the yard met a field. The music drifted out from the lights. I could hear Lily laughing at something Tyler had said. Claire was talking to one of her friends, and she caught my eye across the yard and did this small, unhurried smile that I've never been able to adequately describe. I thought about the man sitting alone at a kitchen table 2 years earlier, with a glass of bourbon and a phone he hadn't meant to pick up. I thought about what I thought I'd lost. And I realized that I hadn't lost the life I wanted. I'd just been living the wrong version of it, and it took the whole thing falling apart to find out where the right one was. I'm not someone who believes everything happens for a reason. That's too tidy. Some things just happen, and then you decide what kind of person you're going to be in the aftermath. I decided to be the kind of person who doesn't let bitterness run the long game, who builds instead of destroys, who shows his kids by example that you can take a hit that levels you and still get back up and make something good. Chester is 11 now and mostly sleeps in a patch of sunlight by the back door. Tyler is finishing graduate school in the fall. Lily got into every program she applied to and is choosing between two she loves equally, which is a good problem to have. My firm just landed the largest contract in its history, and Claire, on a Tuesday evening last month, was sitting at the kitchen table going over a landscape proposal for a new public park project, and she looked up when I walked in and said, "How was your day?" The most ordinary question in the world, and I thought, this is exactly this. That's the whole story. It's not dramatic and it's not tidy, and there are parts of it I'm still working through. But it's mine, and I wouldn't trade where it ended for anything. I've thought a lot about what I'd tell someone standing where I was 2 years ago, sitting alone at a kitchen table, holding a phone they never meant to pick up, watching their entire understanding of their life rearrange itself in about 90 seconds. I don't have a clean answer, but I have some honest ones. The first thing I'd say is that what happened to Derek wasn't luck, and it wasn't something I manufactured. He walked into his own consequences the way arrogant people usually do, confidently, without looking down. He believed that charm and certainty were the same thing as control. They're not. A man who builds his life on taking things that belong to someone else eventually finds himself with nothing that belongs to him. That's not a cosmic principle. That's just how the math works out when you're that careless with other people's trust. Sandra made a choice. She made it over and over again for 4 months. And then she stood in my kitchen and told me the man she'd chosen thought I was just a provider. I've had a lot of time to sit with that word. Provider. Like it's something small. Like the man who built something from nothing, who stayed up until midnight over blueprints, who drove his daughter to school every morning for 11 years and never once thought of it as a sacrifice. Like that man was just furniture that happened to pay bills. The people who reduce others that way do it because it makes the choice easier. It was never really about me. It was about a story she needed to tell herself to justify what she'd already decided to do. What I'm most proud of isn't the prenup, though I'm glad it held. It's that I didn't lose myself in the aftermath. That's harder than it sounds. There's a version of this story where I spent 5 years bitter and closed off and teaching my kids, by example, that betrayal is something you never fully recover from. I could have been that man. The anger was certainly there. But I made a decision early on, maybe the night I sat with Lily in the garage watching her be braver than I felt, that I was not going to let someone else's failures write the rest of my chapters. Lily taught me something without meaning to. She'd known something was wrong for 2 months and she carried that alone because she didn't want to blow up the family on a maybe. That kind of restraint in a 16-year-old is remarkable. It reminded me that the people around us are watching how we handle the hard things, and they're learning from it whether we intend to teach or not. Your kids don't need you to be invincible. They need you to be honest, functional, and still standing. That's enough. That's actually everything, the intelligence part. And I mean that not as book smart, but as knowing the difference between what's real and what's a story you're telling yourself, is what I think saves people in situations like mine. I could have spent months trying to figure out where I went wrong as a husband, whether I'd missed something I could have fixed. I did that for a little while. Then I stopped because the honest answer was that what Sandra wanted wasn't something I'd failed to provide. It was something she decided she deserved to take without asking. Those are different problems, and only one of them belongs to me. Claire sitting at the kitchen table asking, "How was your day?" That's not a small thing. After everything, ordinary is the whole point. I used to think a good life was something you built in the extraordinary moments. Now I think it's something you recognize in the quiet ones. If you've done the work to get there and you haven't let the hard years harden you past the point of being able to receive it, build carefully. Trust your gut earlier than I did, and don't let anyone convince you that steadiness is the same thing as smallness. It isn't. Not even close.